All right, this is lesson 2. It's all about the cell. And so our essential questions here are, how are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells similar, and how are they different? And what do the structures in a cell do? So we're going to be learning about the cell membrane, the cell wall, cytoplasm, the cytoskeleton, what is an organelle. We're going to learn about a lot of different types of organelles, and you probably saw that from the vocabulary you did the other day. I put a lot of organelles in there. So there's a lot of vocabulary for this, just the first 2 lessons of this chapter. We're not even covering lessons 3 and 4 in this chapter. We're just going to cover the first 2. So lots of organelles, lots of vocabulary. The nucleus is probably the most important of the organelles, so we'll spend some time talking about that. And then another important organelle in plants, which is the chloroplast. On page 505, cell shape and movement. You might recall from lesson 1 that all living things are made up of one or more cells. As illustrated in figure 4, cells come in many shapes and sizes. The size and shape of a cell relates to its job or function. Now, this is very important. So in the video you watched about macromolecules for the amoeba sisters, they talked about this, how the shape of the macromolecule relates to its function. And so that's the same for cells themselves, and it's also the same for the organelles that we'll see inside of the cells. Okay, so shape, size and shape relates to job and function. So for example, a human red blood cell cannot be seen without a microscope. Its small size and disc shape enable it to pass easily through the smallest blood vessels. The shape of a nerve cell enables it to send signals over long distances. Some plant cells are hollow and make up tube-like structures that carry materials through a plant. The structures that make up a cell also have unique functions. Think about how the players on a football team perform different tasks to move the ball down the field. In a similar way, a cell is made of different structures that perform different functions that keep a cell alive. You will read about some of these structures in this lesson. First, let's look at the cell membrane. Although different types of cells perform different functions, all cells have some structures in common. As shown in figure 5 and figure 6, every cell is surrounded by a protective covering called a membrane. The cell membrane is a flexible covering that protects the inside of a cell from the environment outside of the cell. Cell membranes are mostly made of 2 different macromolecules, proteins and a type of lipid called phospholipids. Think again about a football team. The defense line tries to stop the other team from moving forward with the football. In a similar way, a cell membrane protects the cell from the outside environment. So reading check, what are cell membranes made of? Well, they're made of phospholipids, and it's in a bilayer. I'm going to show you that to you in just a second. And they also have proteins embedded within the membrane. Okay, what I want to show you here, this is a cell, and this is its layer. It's the layer of the cell membrane, and then the space in between here, and you can see this kind of blown up, space in between here is what's in between cells. And then here's another, the beginning of another cell, so that's its cell membrane as well. So this is an actual photograph from a particular type of what am I trying to say? A type of microscope. I think it's a scanning microscope. I'm not sure. But anyway, I want to show you what an artwork picture of a cell would look like. Okay, so here we have, these are the phospholipids. Okay, these are the phospholipids. Part of the phospholipid is attracted to water, and it's on the outside, and the lipid part is not attracted to water, so it's on the inside. So you've got 2 layers of phospholipids, and then embedded within the cell membrane you have these proteins. You also have some carbohydrates that communicate with the cell things around the cell. So you have some types of carbohydrates sticking out there too, but these are proteins. And so most of the cell membrane is made up of these phospholipids in a bilayer and these proteins. Next, let's look at cell walls. So every cell has a cell membrane, but some cells are also surrounded by a structure called the cell wall. Plant cells such as the one in figure 5, fungal cells, so fungi like bacteria, or no, I'm trying to say like mushrooms and yeast, those kinds of fungus would have molds. Those all have a particular type of cell wall. Bacteria, some bacteria have cell walls. Some types of protists have cell walls. Okay, so a cell wall is a stiff structure outside of the cell membrane. So a cell wall protects a cell from attack by viruses and other harmful organisms. In some plant cells and fungal cells, a cell wall helps maintain the cell shape and gives structural support. So animals do not have cell walls, but some other organisms that we just discussed do. Okay, so looking at the plant cell, this is an example of a plant cell or drawing of a plant cell. You can see the cell wall is along the outside. Here's your cell membrane, and here's the cell wall. But if we look at an animal cell, you can see that the animal cell only has a cell membrane. It does not have a cell wall. And this picture of an animal cell looks more circular, if you will, than the picture of the plant cell we just saw, where the plant cell looks more boxy. That's because it has a cell wall. That cell wall gives it more structure and support. All right, next we're going to talk about some cell appendages. An appendage is just like an arm or a leg. It's something that sticks out. So arms, legs, claws, and antennae are all types of appendages. Well, cells can have appendages too. Cell appendages are often used for movement. Flagella, that's a plural, the singular is flagellum. So flagella are long tail-like appendages that whip back and forth and move a cell. I'm going to take a moment and show you some flagella. Okay, this is an example of a euglena. That's a type of protist that has a flagella. And let me get rid of that, hold on. You can see that it uses the flagella to move. Okay, so that's a protist. It's a unicellular protist. It's not a bacteria. It's quite a bit bigger than bacteria. But those are tiny little euglena that you can see moving around, and they're moving around by using their flagella. All right, this is another example of an organism that has a flagella, and you can see the flagella at the end over here. Okay, but these are bacteria, so they're not quite as big as what we just saw with the euglena, and so the picture is not as good because the type of photograph, the type of microscope that they're using there. But okay, another cell appendage is cilia. Cilia are short hair-like structures, and they can move a cell or move molecules away from a cell. A microscopic organism called a paramecium moves around its watery environment using its cilia. The cilia in your windpipe move harmful substances away from your lung. Okay, I'm going to show you a paramecia, and this paramecium, again, is a tiny little protist, just kind of like the little euglena, but now instead of using flagella, it's using these tiny little cilia. I don't know if you can see, there's tiny little cilia on the outside of it that's causing it to move. That's kind of helping it swim. Okay, this is a video of your cilia in your nasal cells. Your book references that you have cilia in your windpipe. You also have them in your nose, inside your nose. And so let me show you what that looks like. You can see the cilia moving, and it's moving things around. Okay, the cytoplasm and the cytoskeleton. In Lesson 1, you read that water is the main ingredient in a cell. Most of this water is in the cytoplasm, a fluid inside a cell that contains salts and other molecules. The cytoplasm also contains a cell's cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is a network of thread-like proteins that are joined together. The proteins form a framework inside the cell. This framework gives a cell its shape and helps it move. Cilia and flagella are made from the same proteins that make up the cytoskeleton. Okay, this little picture shows us some cytoskeleton. This is actually inside of a breast cell. The orange shows a protein called, let's see, I'm going to scroll down here. It's a double cortin. It's called double cortin. And then the purple shows the protein actin. And so they've just used some fluorescent assay to kind of label. And so you can see that that protein that's making up the cytoskeleton is just spread throughout the cell. Okay, on the next page, on page 508, we're going to talk about cell types. We're not really just talking about cell types, we're also talking about organism types, because we're looking at prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. So that's not just describing a cell, but it's because they do have very a lot of differences in their cells, but also organisms. So when we talk about prokaryotic organisms, we're talking about bacteria and some archaeobacteria, which is just a very old, if you will, kind of bacterial unicellular organisms. When we're talking about eukaryotic, that's going to include most of the organisms that we think about today: plants and animals and fungi and protists and I think I got everything. Anyway, so there's a big difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and so that's what we're going to talk about. In the cells, there's a difference, and of course in the organisms. All right, so cell types. Recall that the use of microscopes enabled scientists to discover cells. With more advanced microscopes, scientists discovered that all cells can be grouped into two types: prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells. The genetic material in a prokaryotic cell is not surrounded by a membrane, as shown in Figure 8. This is the most important feature of a prokaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells also do not have many of the other cell parts that you will read about later in this lesson. Most prokaryotic cells are unicellular organisms and are called prokaryotes. Okay, so they don't have all of these organelles that we're going to talk about. The only organelle that we're going to talk about that they do have is a ribosome, but it is not a membrane-bound organelle. That is the only one really that doesn't have a membrane, and so you will find those in the prokaryotic cells, but not but the other membrane-bound organelles we will not see. Okay, let's look at. So here's an example of a prokaryotic organism, and this bacteria you can see is very small. You can see the 0.5 micrometers is, it's probably about a width of 0.5 micrometers, and then maybe a length of 2 micrometers. It doesn't have any, you can't really see anything inside of it, like there aren't any organelles that pop out. There's something called a nucleoid, so maybe that's where the DNA is, but it's not inside of a nucleus. Okay, so there's a membrane around it, but there aren't any membranes inside of it. You can see on this diagram of that that the DNA is here in the middle. It's kind of just floating around, not in a membrane-bound organelle. It's not in a nucleus. There are ribosomes in it, cytoplasm. It has, this one particular one has a flagellum. Not all do, but some do. So it can have appendages like flagellum. It has a cell wall, a cell membrane, but it does not have any membrane-bound organelles. All right, so eukaryotic cells, plants, animals, fungi, and protists are all made of eukaryotic cells, such as the ones shown in Figure 5 and Figure 6, and they are called eukaryotes. With few exceptions, each eukaryotic cell has genetic material that is surrounded by a membrane. Every eukaryotic cell also has other structures called organelles, which have specialized functions. Most organelles are surrounded by membranes. Eukaryotic cells are usually larger than prokaryotic cells. About 10 prokaryotic cells would fit inside one eukaryotic cell. So our key concepts check says, how are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells similar, and how are they different? Well, both cell types have genetic material. In prokaryotic cells, the genetic material floats freely in the cytoplasm, and in eukaryotic cells, the genetic material is inside the nucleus. Eukaryotic cells are usually larger and have more parts or organelles than prokaryotic cells. And prokaryotic cells do not have membrane-bound organelles like eukaryotic cells do. Okay, here's a picture of a eukaryotic cell, and you can see the nucleus, the Golgi vesicles, a lysosome, which is just a kind of a storage place in the storage organelle, and it usually has some things that will help break down different parts of the cell. Mitochondria, okay, so there's a mitochondria in there. So mitochondria are another organelle that we're going to be talking about. And you can see that the micrometers, so that's 1 micrometer. So if you take that, multiply, or you could probably fit maybe 8 or 9 of those across, maybe 4 or 5 of them across the other way. So you can see that this is a bigger cell than the other cell that we just looked at. All right, now we're going to talk about the different cell organelles. And again, these are found in eukaryotic cells. Most of these will not be found in the prokaryotic cells. The only one you're going to find is the ribosome, really. Okay, so cell organelles. As you have just read, organelles are eukaryotic cell structures with specific functions. Organelles enable cells to carry out different functions at the same time. For example, cells can obtain energy from food, store information, make macromolecules, and get rid of waste materials all at the same time because different organelles perform the different tasks. The nucleus. The largest organelle inside most eukaryotic cells is the nucleus, as is shown in Figure 9. The nucleus is the part of the eukaryotic cell that directs cell activity and contains genetic information stored in DNA. DNA is organized into structures called chromosomes. The number of chromosomes in a nucleus is different for different species of organisms. For example, kangaroo cells contain 6 pairs of chromosomes. Most human cells contain 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, so here's a picture of a nucleus. The nucleus is in the center of the cell, and it directs cell activity. It's surrounded by a nuclear membrane. And so here you see an enhanced transmission electron microscope picture of a cell, of a nucleus. In addition to chromosomes, the nucleus contains proteins and an organelle called the nucleolus. The nucleolus is often seen as a large dark spot in the nucleus of a cell. The nucleolus makes ribosomes, organelles that are involved in the production of proteins. You will read about ribosomes later in this lesson. Surrounding the nucleus are 2 membranes that form a structure called the nuclear envelope. The nuclear envelope contains many pores. Certain molecules, such as ribosomes and RNA, move into and out of the nucleus through these pores. What is the nuclear envelope? The nuclear envelope is a structure formed by 2 membranes that surrounds the nucleus of a cell. Manufacturing molecules. You might recall from Lesson 1 that proteins are important molecules in cells. Proteins are made on small structures called ribosomes. Unlike other cell organelles, a ribosome is not surrounded by a membrane. Ribosomes are in a cell's cytoplasm, and they also can be attached to a web-like organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER. As shown in Figure 10, the ER spreads from the nucleus throughout most of the cytoplasm. ER with ribosomes on its surface is called rough ER. Rough ER is the site of protein production. ER without ribosomes is called smooth ER. It makes lipids such as cholesterol. Smooth ER is important because it helps remove harmful substances from a cell. Reading check. Contrast smooth ER and rough ER. Smooth ER makes lipids or cholesterol and removes harmful substances from the cell and does not have ribosomes. Rough ER has ribosomes and is the site of protein production. Here you can see an artist's interpretation of what the smooth and the rough endoplasmic reticulum looks like. So you can see the tiny little dots on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Those are ribosomes, but it's not on the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, here's a picture taken by an electron microscope. And so you can see the difference between the smooth ER, let me see, adjust that a little bit. So the smooth ER over here does not have the tiny little dots on it, whereas the rough ER has those little dots, which are the ribosomes. Processing energy. All living things require energy in order to survive. Cells process some energy in specialized organelles. Most eukaryotic cells contain hundreds of organelles called mitochondria, as shown in Figure 10. Some cells in a human heart can contain 1,000 mitochondria. Like the nucleus, a mitochondrion is surrounded by two membranes. Energy is released during chemical reactions that occur in the mitochondria. This energy is stored in high-energy molecules called ATP, which is short for adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the fuel for cellular processes such as growth, cell division, and material transport. And I like to think of ATP as like the money. If you want anything done in a cell, you need the ATP, the money, which is produced in your mitochondria. Here's an artist's interpretation of mitochondria, where you can see that there are two different membranes, an inner membrane and an outer membrane, and some production of ATP is going on in there. Here's an electron micrograph of a mitochondrion. You can see the matrix, the outer and inner membrane labeled. Plant cells and some protists, such as algae, also contain organelles called chloroplasts, as shown in Figure 11. Chloroplasts are membrane-bound organelles that use light energy, and they make food, a sugar called glucose, from water and carbon dioxide in a process known as photosynthesis. The sugar contains stored chemical energy that can be released when a cell needs it. You will read more about photosynthesis in Lesson 1, and unfortunately we won't get to cover, Lesson 4. You won't get to cover Lesson 4 this year. So, reading check. Which types of cells contain chloroplasts? Plant cells and some protists, such as algae, contain chloroplasts. Okay, here's an example of a chloroplast. You can see that it also, just like a mitochondrion, has an inner and an outer membrane. The chloroplasts also have something called thylakoids, and they just look like stacked coins. That's where the photosynthesis is taking place, in the thylakoid membranes. Here's an electron micrograph of a chloroplast. You can see the thylakoid, the stacked thylakoids there that we saw in the picture, or the diagram that was drawn. Processing, transporting, and storing molecules. Near the ER, or the endoplasmic reticulum, is an organelle that looks like a stack of pancakes. This is the Golgi apparatus, as shown in Figure 11. It prepares proteins for their specific jobs or functions. Then it packages the proteins into tiny membrane-bound ball-like structures called vesicles. Vesicles are organelles that transport substances from one area of a cell to another area of a cell. Some vesicles in an animal cell are called lysosomes. Lysosomes contain substances that help break down and recycle cellular components. Some cells also have sac-like structures called vacuoles. Vacuoles are organelles that store food, water, and waste material. A typical plant cell usually has one large vacuole that stores water and other substances. Some animal cells have many small vacuoles. So often when you see a plant cell, you'll see a huge vacuole that takes up most of the cell. I'll show you that. Our key concept check says, what is the function of the Golgi apparatus? It prepares proteins for their specific functions and packages them into vesicles for transport. Okay, here's an artist's interpretation of what the Golgi apparatus looks like. Let's see if we can find a micrograph. All right, here's a micrograph from an electron microscope of the Golgi apparatus. Here's an electron micrograph of some vesicles inside of a cell, so a peroxisome, a lysosome. Those are just some examples of different vesicles. And here's an artist's interpretation of a plant cell, and you can see this really big vacuole. This blue thing here is just a vacuole. It's really big. So let's take a look at that in a photograph. Here's an electron micrograph of a plant cell, and you can see that really big white spot in the middle is the vacuole. So that's where all the water is being stored in the cell. You can also see these the chloroplasts around the edge. Chloroplasts here and here and here and here and here, making food for the cell. Okay, we're on to the lesson 2 review. Number 1 says distinguish between the cell wall and the cell membrane. Well, the cell wall is a rigid structure that provides support and protection in plants and some bacteria, whereas the cell membrane is a flexible covering that is found around all cells. Number 2, use the terms mitochondria and chloroplasts in a sentence. Here's an example. Mitochondria and chloroplasts are used to process energy. Number 3, define organelle in your own words. Well, an organelle is a structure in a cell that's surrounded by a membrane and used for a specialized task. Number 4, which organelle is used to store water? We just saw that. It's D, vacuole. Number 5, explain the role of the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton provides structural support to the cell. It's made up of many proteins, and we saw some cytoskeleton examples. Number 6, draw a prokaryotic cell and label its parts. That is you on your own, but let me show you an example. All right, so a prokaryotic cell, again, here's my example. A prokaryotic cell might have a flagellum, or maybe it doesn't. Okay, sorry about that. So you can see the black is the cell wall. Inside of the cell wall is the cell membrane. The DNA is usually in some kind of circular formation in the middle of the cell. And then the only real organelles that you'll see is the ribosomes. And then you've got cytoplasm throughout. Okay. Number 7, compare the roles of the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. Well, the endoplasmic reticulum makes proteins, if it's the rough ER, and lipids, if it's the smooth ER, whereas the Golgi apparatus prepares proteins for their specific functions and packages them into vesicles for transport. Okay, number 9. I'm sorry, I skipped one. Number 8. Explain how the structure of the cells below relates to their function. So these are tube-like cells that are hollow, and they transport materials in plants. So the xylem and phloem are those tube-like cells inside of plants that transport materials. And then number 9, copy the table below and fill it in to compare the structures of a plant cell to the structures of an animal cell. So think through that for just a moment, and then we'll show you the answer. Okay, so let's look at that. So a plant cell does have a cell wall, but an animal cell does not. They both have mitochondria. The plant cell has a chloroplast, but the animal cell does not. They both have nuclei. That would be the plural of nucleus. You don't say nucleuses, you say nuclei. The plant cell has a large vacuole. Sometimes the animal cell will have tiny little vacuoles, but for the most part, no. And then a lysosome. The plant cell does not, where the animal cell does. Number 10, analyze why are most organelles surrounded by membranes? Well, think about it. It makes sense. In order to perform the functions that they need to perform without interference from other organelles, they need to be kind of closed off. And so those membranes allow them to be closed off and do what they need to do inside. Number 11, compare the features of eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So a prokaryotic cell lacks a nucleus and most other organelles except for ribosomes, while a eukaryotic cell has a nucleus and many other membrane-bound organelles. All right, and then we are finished with lesson 2.